The sound of distant sirens and muffled voices filled the alley as Lena dragged the unconscious man from the trash heap. His suit, once crisp and expensive, was now stained with dirt and grime. His face was pale, almost lifeless, his breath shallow. Lena, a homeless girl with nothing but the clothes on her back, was the only one who dared to help him. She had seen many people walk by. Their eyes glazed over as they ignored the man in need, but not her. Despite her own struggles, she couldn't turn away. She couldn't leave him to die in the trash. She wasn't sure why she cared. Maybe it was because she had been through so much herself. Or maybe it was because deep down, she knew what it was like to feel invisible. Like the world had forgotten you. No one had ever helped her when she was at her lowest. But here she was, with nothing but a shred of compassion, trying to save a stranger. With every ounce of strength she had, she managed to drag him to a nearby alleyway, away from the prying eyes of the world. She couldn't let him die alone. As the hours passed, Lena stayed by his side, praying for him to wake up. She'd never seen someone like him before. His expensive clothes, his polished shoes, the watch that seemed to sparkle, even in the dim alley. She couldn't fathom how someone so rich had ended up in this state, but that didn't matter now. What mattered was that she had made a choice to help, to give him a chance at life. And when he finally stirred, his eyes opening slowly, a wave of relief washed over her. He was alive. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, weak. His gaze flickered around, confused, before settling on Lena. "Who are you?" Lena hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. The truth felt so distant. "I'm Lena. I found you in the trash. You were unconscious." His brow furrowed as he tried to sit up, but his body trembled with weakness. She offered him a hand, and he took it. He looked at her for a long moment, disbelief in his eyes. "Why would you help me? I'm nothing. I'm nobody." Lena shook her head, her voice steady, though her heart raced. "No one deserves to be left for dead, not even you." His face softened, and for the first time in a long time, he looked vulnerable. "I don't remember how I got here. I don't even remember who I am." Lena smiled softly, helping him to his feet. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're alive. And I'm here to help you get back on your feet." The man's eyes filled with gratitude as he took a deep breath. He felt an overwhelming sense of humility. But the shock of being saved by someone like Lena, a homeless girl who had nothing, made him feel small. His world, once filled with luxury and power, felt like a distant dream. Here he was, on the cold, hard ground, dependent on the kindness of someone he never thought he'd meet. Days passed, and with Lena's help, the man slowly regained his strength. But something was different. As he began to remember fragments of his life, he found himself drawn to her, not out of pity, but because of something deeper. She had saved his life. She had given him hope when he had none. He had nothing left to offer, yet she gave him everything. One morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon, he made a decision that would change everything. He stood in front of her, his voice trembling slightly, but his resolve firm. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did," he said, his eyes searching hers. "But I want to do something for you. You deserve more than this life. I want to give you a chance, take you away from this, to a place where you can have everything you deserve." Lena shook her head, a mix of disbelief and confusion flooding her. "I don't need anything from you. I don't want your money or your mansion. All I wanted was to make sure you lived." The man stepped closer, his eyes filled with determination. "That's not the point. You saved me when no one else would. Now let me give you a life you've never dreamed of. You deserve it." And so, Lena found herself stepping into a world she had never known, a world of luxury, comfort, and privilege. She had gone from sleeping on cold streets to living in a mansion, surrounded by wealth and security. It felt like a dream she couldn't wake up from. But what she soon realized was that it wasn't the mansion that had changed her life. It was the man. The man who, despite his past mistakes and the downfall he had suffered, had found redemption through kindness. He had been given a second chance at life, and now he was determined to offer the same to her. Lena never expected to be given anything. She had learned long ago that life didn't offer you second chances. It just took what it wanted and left you behind. But through the kindness of a stranger, she learned that people could still change, that miracles could happen when you least expected them. As she stood in the grand foyer of the mansion, looking out at the view that stretched far beyond her wildest imagination, she realized something. Her life was no longer about survival. It was about living. And that was more than she could have ever asked for. Lena had seen the worst of the world. Her clothes were ragged and her shoes had worn down from countless miles of walking the unforgiving streets. Every day she fought just to survive, not knowing where her next meal would come from or where she would sleep at night. She wasn't unfamiliar with despair. It was her constant companion. The world had turned its back on her long ago, and the streets had become her only home. But even in the midst of her own struggle, Lena had not lost her sense of empathy. She had seen people walk by, turning their heads, ignoring the suffering of others. It was as if the world had hardened their hearts to those who had nothing. But not Lena. Despite her own pain, she never became numb to the suffering around her. She had learned to feel for others, to extend kindness when it seemed like the world was indifferent. So when she found the millionaire lying unconscious in the trash, it didn't matter that he was rich or powerful, or that he had lived a life so different from hers. All that mattered was that he was in need, and that need stirred something deep within her. The sight of him, abandoned and helpless, triggered an innate sense of compassion she couldn't ignore. It was as if fate had led her to him, a homeless girl with nothing to offer, now holding the life of a man who had everything. She wasn't thinking about the risks. She wasn't thinking about what it would cost her. She only thought about what would happen if she turned away. She knew what it was like to be invisible, to be someone no one cared about. She couldn't bear the thought of this man suffering, alone, tossed aside like trash. With every ounce of her remaining strength, she managed to drag him away from the heap of discarded lives and into a place where he could at least have a chance. As she looked down at him, her heart clenched. His face was so pale, so lifeless. His expensive clothes were now nothing more than rags. He wasn't some wealthy, untouchable figure anymore. He was a person, just like her, vulnerable and in need. She saw beyond the suit, the watch, the polished shoes. She saw a human being, and that human being was in her hands, depending on her. Lena didn't have much, but in that moment, she gave everything she had. Her heart bled for him. It wasn't just about saving him. It was about offering him the same compassion she had always wished for herself. She wasn't looking for recognition or reward. She didn't need anything from him. She simply wanted to help, because deep inside she knew what it felt like to be lost, to be forgotten. As she sat by his side, tending to him with what little she had, her jacket as a pillow, a cup of water she had managed to find in a nearby alley, she realized that her innocence, her pure-hearted desire to help, was something no amount of wealth could ever buy. The world may have judged her for her situation, may have looked down on her, but in her heart, she knew that she was doing something far greater than anything money could offer. When he finally woke up, confused and weak, his eyes met hers, and, for a brief moment, they shared a silence that spoke volumes. He didn't need to know her story. He didn't need to know what led her to this moment. What mattered was that she was there, and she had saved him. Her actions were driven by an innocence so pure, it could not be tainted by the cruelty of the world. As he struggled to comprehend his situation, Lena offered him no judgment, no reproach for his former life. She didn't care about his past, or who he had been before that fateful moment. To her, he was just a man, someone in need. That simple, selfless understanding was what truly made Lena stand out. She wasn't like others who saw the world in black and white. She had learned to see the humanity in everyone, regardless of their wealth or status. The truth was, Lena didn't need anything in return. She wasn't saving him for her own gain. Her innocence, her pure desire to help, was enough for her. In a world that had taught her to fight for every scrap, she understood that the real power came from kindness, from looking beyond the surface and seeing someone for who they truly were. And for her, that was enough. As the days passed, the millionaire, who had been unconscious for so long, gradually regained his strength. But there was something different about him now, something he couldn't quite explain. He had woken up to find himself in an unfamiliar place, an old, worn-down apartment with peeling walls and the faint smell of dust. It was a far cry from the luxury penthouse he was used to. The woman who had saved him, the homeless girl, sat by his side, offering him a glass of water, her eyes full of kindness and compassion, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. At first, he had been too disoriented to fully understand what had happened. His mind had still been clouded with the events that led to his downfall. He was used to his comfortable life, where he could buy anything he wanted, and the world bent to his will. But now, he was here, staring at a woman who had nothing, yet had given him everything. The irony was not lost on him. This girl, Lena, who had spent her life struggling for survival on the streets, had risked her own life to save a man like him, someone who had never truly known what it meant to fight for his survival. She had pulled him from the trash, literally, and, in doing so, had opened his eyes to a reality he had never even considered. He had lived a life of privilege and excess, but he had also lived a life devoid of true connection, compassion, and humility. As the days went on, the millionaire, whom we now know as Ethan, began to reflect on his past. He had always thought of himself as a self-made man, someone who had built his empire from the ground up. He believed that his wealth and success were the result of his intelligence and hard work, and that anyone who was homeless or struggling simply hadn't worked hard enough. It was a cold, transactional view of the world, one that never allowed for empathy or understanding. But now, sitting in this humble apartment, he saw things through a different lens. Ethan had never once thought about the lives of the people who worked for him, the ones who cleaned his office, delivered his food, or took care of the small, unnoticed tasks that made his life easy. He had never stopped to wonder what their lives were like, what they had to endure to make ends meet. To him, they were just faceless employees. But now, Lena had shown him the truth. Ethan began to ask himself difficult questions. Why had he never cared about the people who worked for him? Why had he never looked beyond his own success to see the struggles of others? He realized how out of touch he had been with the world, how he had been living in a bubble of privilege, blind to the harsh realities that so many others faced every single day. It wasn't just the material wealth that had kept him detached. It was the emotional numbness that came with always getting what he wanted. He had spent his life accumulating things, but he had never truly experienced the value of human connection or the power of empathy. His world had been built on transactions, money for goods, power for respect. But he had never understood what it meant to give without expecting anything in return. Lena's presence in his life was now shaking his beliefs to their core. She had no reason to help him. She didn't owe him anything. In fact, he was the one who had everything to lose. Yet she had saved him, treated him with kindness, and even offered him her compassion. She didn't look at him as the millionaire or the CEO. She saw him simply as a person in need, and that was all that mattered to her. Ethan began to see the flaws in his own thinking. The world wasn't a series of transactions. It was about people, about human connections, and about lifting each other up. He had lived his life thinking that success was measured by what you could accumulate, but now he realized that true success was about how you treated others, how you helped those who were less fortunate, and how you used your position of privilege to make a difference in the lives of others. This was his moral awakening. As the days passed, he began to question everything he had built. What was the point of wealth if it didn't lead to happiness, or at the very least, to a meaningful connection with others? What good was it to be successful if you couldn't share that success? If you couldn't help others rise from the same struggles you had once known? Ethan had been given a second chance, and he knew that this was not a coincidence. This girl, Lena, had not only saved his life, but had also opened his eyes to a new way of seeing the world. He was no longer the man he had been. The person who had once been cold, detached, and driven solely by profit was now someone who could feel empathy, someone who wanted to make a real difference. As he sat in that small, dimly lit apartment, he made a promise to himself. He would never be the same again. He would use his wealth, his influence, and his resources not just to build a bigger empire, but to help those who were struggling. He would invest in people, in real connections, and in lifting others up. It was a powerful moment of self-realization, one that would forever change the course of his life. And it was all thanks to a homeless girl who had shown him the true value of compassion, empathy, and selflessness. As Lena sat beside the bed where Ethan, the millionaire she had saved, lay recovering, the silence in the room felt like a heavy weight. His condition was improving, but his mind seemed to be in turmoil. Days of reflection had passed, and with each moment, his growing awareness of what he had once been and who he had become now ate away at him. It was a strange feeling for Ethan, this new sense of vulnerability. He wasn't used to feeling this way, helpless, exposed, and most of all, incredibly ashamed. Lena, on the other hand, was calm. The world she lived in had already taught her harsh lessons. She had learned to navigate through pain, through suffering, through hopelessness. But even amidst her struggles, she never once lost her humanity, never once became numb to the world around her. As she watched over Ethan, her heart weighed with an unfamiliar emotion, compassion. Ethan had no idea why she had saved him. To him, it didn't make sense. She had nothing. She had no reason to care for someone like him, someone who lived in a world of luxury and privilege. But Lena wasn't concerned with the boundaries of class or wealth. To her, the human spirit mattered more than any amount of money or status. One evening, as the golden light of sunset filtered through the dusty curtains, Ethan finally found the courage to speak. He had spent days ruminating over his past, his life, his choices, his complete detachment from the suffering of others. But nothing had affected him more deeply than the memory of Lena dragging him from the trash, fighting against the odds to save him. His thoughts caught up to his heart, and he turned toward her, his voice shaky. "Why did you save me?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lena didn't answer immediately. She stared at him for a moment, her eyes soft but unyielding. The world she had known was brutal. She had experienced loss, betrayal, and an unforgiving hunger for survival. But none of that had ever hardened her soul. It had merely made her more aware of the value of life, the fragility of human existence. And so, as she met Ethan's gaze, she simply spoke the words that echoed the truth she had always known. "Because you were a person in need," she said, her voice steady, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It didn't matter who you were or how much money you had. You needed help and I gave it." Ethan was taken aback by her response. For the first time in his life, someone had treated him not as a millionaire, not as a successful businessman, but as a person, someone with real emotions, someone who had a soul worth saving. The simplicity of her words hit him harder than anything he had ever heard in his entire life. He struggled to comprehend it. Here he was, lying in a stranger's bed, saved by a woman who had nothing to offer but her heart, and he couldn't fathom why. Why had she cared enough to pull him from the wreckage of his life? It didn't make sense to him. His entire life had been built on success, power, and control. But now, lying there in that humble room, he realized how empty that life had truly been. In that moment, the walls he had spent years building around, his heart started to crumble. Lena noticed the look in Ethan's eyes, the confusion, the guilt, the helplessness. She could see that he was struggling, but she didn't push him. Instead, she gave him the space he needed, even as she remained present, offering him something no one else had ever given him: unconditional support. For the first time in his life, Ethan didn't feel like a failure for asking for help. In fact, the more he sat with the realization of how self-absorbed he had been, the more he started to feel that he had been missing out on the most fundamental aspect of being human: connection. As the days passed, Ethan began to spend more time with Lena. At first, he just wanted to talk to her, to understand her better, to make sense of her selflessness. But the more they spoke, the more he saw how deeply rooted her sense of kindness was. She had nothing, yet she was the richest person he had ever met. She didn't just talk about compassion, she lived it. She didn't just say the words, "I care." She showed it through every action, every gesture. One day, as they were sitting on the small couch, Lena reached over and touched his hand. It was the first time she had initiated any sort of physical contact, and Ethan flinched slightly, surprised by the tenderness of her touch. But as she held his hand, she smiled softly at him, and it was like a weight was lifted off his chest. "You're not alone, Ethan," she said gently, her voice like a balm to his wounded soul. "I'll help you get back on your feet, but you need to help yourself too. You need to find what truly matters. This life isn't about money. It's about people. It's about love, kindness, and how we treat one another." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. Her words weren't just comforting, they were a revelation. They unlocked something inside of him that had been buried for so long, something he had forgotten in his pursuit of success and material wealth. He realized in that moment that everything he had built his life on was a facade. The mansion, the cars, the private jets, all of it had been meaningless. What mattered were the relationships, the moments of connection, and the ability to care for others. Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes, but he didn't try to hide them. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel everything: the guilt, the regret, and the deep longing for a life of meaning. He squeezed Lena's hand, silently thanking her for saving him, not just from the trash, but from a life he had unknowingly wasted. As the days wore on, Ethan began to recover, not only physically, but emotionally as well. The world outside the small, humble room he shared with Lena seemed far away. His mansion, his wealth, and the life he had once taken for granted felt like distant memories now. Yet amid this physical healing, there was a deeper transformation taking place within him, one that he could never have anticipated. This was not a journey toward fame or fortune. It was a journey back to humanity, back to the simple truths of life that he had lost sight of in his relentless pursuit of success. Lena, though, had no idea just how much her actions had begun to change Ethan. She had no idea how deeply he was beginning to appreciate the quiet strength she exuded. Every day she would wake up before dawn, tend to her few meager possessions, and then check on Ethan. She did all of this without a word of complaint, without ever drawing attention to the sacrifices she made. She never asked for anything in return. There was no desire for recognition, no expectation of reward, only the knowledge that Ethan needed someone to help him, and she was there to do it. Lena had always lived a life of silent sacrifice. Her childhood had been riddled with hardships, and as an adult, she had fought tooth and nail to survive in a world that seemed indifferent to her struggles. Yet, even in her darkest moments, when she had little to give, she had always found a way to care for others. When Ethan arrived, unconscious and broken, she did not hesitate. She didn't think twice about whether it was worth her time or energy. She simply acted because in that moment it was the right thing to do. Each morning she would bring him water, medicine, and small bits of food, watching over him with unwavering attention. She could have left him there, could have moved on with her own life, But instead, she chose to stay by his side, making sure that he had what he needed, even when she didn't have much to give. There was no grandeur in her actions, no drama, no thank you to be received. She did it all in silence, her heart fully invested in the well-being of a man who had once seemed so far out of her reach. And yet, what struck Ethan the most was that she never once asked for anything in return, not even a thank you, not even an acknowledgement of the monumental effort she had put into his recovery. She simply smiled at him when he showed signs of improvement, and she listened when he spoke of his regrets. She was his quiet support, his rock in a storm of emotional upheaval, but she never sought any praise for it. To Lena, it was simply a part of who she was, someone who cared deeply for the well-being of others, even when it came at great personal cost. One evening, as Ethan sat up in bed, staring at the window, his mind weighed down by the overwhelming guilt he felt for the life he had led, he finally turned to Lena. He had been thinking about everything she had done for him, the way she had cared for him when no one else would, the way she had treated him with kindness and dignity despite his flaws. It was in that moment that the full weight of her silent sacrifice hit him. She had given so much, yet she never once asked for anything. It humbled him to the core. "Lena," he said, his voice trembling. "You've done so much for me. You've saved my life, and I don't know how I can ever repay you for what you've done." Lena turned to him, her expression calm and gentle. "You don't need to repay me," she replied softly, as though it were the simplest thing in the world. It was never about repayment. It was about doing what was right. Her words left him speechless. How could someone so selfless, so quiet in her sacrifices, not feel the need for anything in return? How could she continue to give of herself so fully without expecting anything back? It was beyond his understanding, beyond the limits of his experience. Over the following days, as Ethan's physical health improved, his emotional health began to shift as well. He began to understand the depth of what Lena had done for him. Every day she had silently given without expectation, without seeking anything but the satisfaction of knowing that she had done the right thing. And in her silent sacrifice, she had changed his life forever. One night, after Lena had gone to bed, Ethan found himself staring at the ceiling, overwhelmed with emotion. The weight of his regrets, his past mistakes, seemed unbearable. He had spent his entire life focused on accumulating wealth, but now, lying there in that quiet, dimly lit room, he realized that none of it mattered. The mansions, the cars, the private jets, it was all empty. What mattered, what had truly touched him, was the selfless act of a woman who had nothing to give but her heart. He slowly got out of bed, his movements tentative as he crept into the living room where Lena was sleeping on the small couch. He didn't want to wake her, but he couldn't let her sacrifice go unnoticed any longer. He quietly knelt beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. She stirred, waking to see him standing there, his face full of emotion. "I don't deserve you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "But I promise you, I will never forget what you've done for me. I will spend the rest of my life making sure your kindness is not forgotten. You deserve more than anyone I've ever known." Lena looked up at him, her eyes soft but unwavering. She gave a small, tired smile, and in that moment, Ethan knew that no words he could ever say would truly express the depth of his gratitude. Her silent sacrifice had touched him in ways he would never be able to explain, but he would carry it with him always, as the foundation of the person he was becoming. It wasn't just about the mansion he would one day own, or the wealth he would amass. It was about the legacy of kindness, love, and sacrifice that Lena had imparted to him. And though she would never seek recognition for what she had done, Ethan vowed to honor her sacrifice, to give back to the world in the way she had given to him, quietly, selflessly, and without ever expecting anything in return. As the days passed and Ethan began to regain his strength, a subtle shift occurred within Lena. It wasn't just the physical care she had been offering him that mattered. Something deeper began to stir within her. She had always been fiercely independent, capable of handling her own struggles. But this was different. Ethan's presence in her life had begun to spark something profound in her heart, a fierce protectiveness she had never felt before. Lena had always been the type to give without hesitation, but protecting Ethan felt like an entirely new instinct, one that arose not from obligation, but from a deep emotional bond she had started to form. As he slowly became more alert, she watched him with an intensity that reflected both her care and her wariness. The world he had come from, the world of wealth and power, was far removed from the life she knew. She couldn't help but feel that the darker, hidden parts of his past still lingered, waiting to resurface. Ethan had always been surrounded by people who saw him as a means to an end. His wealth and status had attracted opportunists who wanted something from him. He had learned to trust no one, not fully. But in Lena, something was different. She wasn't here to take anything from him, and yet she was giving him everything: her time, her heart, and her energy. This was the first time in his life that he had encountered someone who genuinely wanted nothing in return. Despite his growing feelings of gratitude toward her, Ethan couldn't shake the fear that something might happen to her, something that would take her away from him. The thought of her being hurt, emotionally or physically, triggered something in him that he had not expected. It was as though a part of him, once hardened by years of loneliness, was coming back to life. He couldn't explain it, but it was there. The protector inside him had been awakened. As the days went on, Lena could feel the weight of his unspoken fears. She noticed the way he looked at her when she was cooking, or when she walked too far from the house to gather food. It wasn't possessiveness, but a genuine concern that softened her heart. But at the same time, it ignited something inside her. She had spent so long protecting herself, protecting her own fragile hopes and dreams, that the idea of letting someone protect her, of allowing herself to be vulnerable, was not an easy thing to accept. It wasn't that she didn't trust Ethan. On the contrary, she had come to realize that there was a tenderness to him, a depth she hadn't seen before. One evening, after Lena had spent several hours at the market, her mind raced with thoughts of what might happen to her if she didn't get back to Ethan soon. What if someone took advantage of his situation? She couldn't shake the feeling that the world out there, the one she had grown up in, was full of dangers. Dangers she wanted to shield Ethan from. When she finally returned, her heart skipped a beat when she saw him standing by the door, waiting for her. His expression was one of concern, but his eyes softened when he saw her return. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with a quiet urgency. "I was worried." Lena's chest tightened. The vulnerability in his voice reminded her that despite everything he had endured, despite his status and his previous life of luxury, he wasn't immune to fear. Just like everyone else, he had a breaking point. "I'm fine," she reassured him, trying to brush off her own worries. "But I need you to be careful, Ethan. The world out there can be cruel. You can't trust anyone but me. I won't let anyone hurt you." The words came out more forcefully than she had intended. Her voice had a firmness to it that was unlike anything she had expressed before. It wasn't a plea for recognition. It was a promise. A promise that she would not allow him to fall back into the darkness of his former life. A promise that she would protect him at all costs. Ethan was taken aback by the intensity in her voice. He had never heard her speak with such conviction before, and it struck him deeply. In that moment, he realized something profound. She wasn't just his caretaker, she was his shield. She wasn't just looking after him, she was actively ensuring that no one would ever hurt him again. He understood then, as he stood there in the warmth of the small, modest house that had become his refuge, that Lena's love was unlike any he had ever known. It was not simply a passive affection, it was fierce, determined, and protective. But even as Lena spoke, there was an unspoken fear in her eyes. She knew that there was a limit to what she could do. The world beyond their small home was vast and full of uncertainties. She couldn't always be there to protect him. But what she could do, what she vowed to do, was to fight for his safety with every ounce of her being. And she would not stop until she was sure he would be safe, until she was sure that no one could hurt him again. Ethan had spent his entire life being told how strong he was. But in that moment, he realized that his strength had always been reliant on his wealth and his status. The true strength he had been seeking all his life was in the quiet, unwavering resolve of a woman who had nothing but her heart to offer. And for the first time, he felt safe, not because of his money, not because of his power, but because of Lena's protection, her unyielding determination to keep him safe. Her protective nature was not just a reaction to the danger around them. It was an act of love, a demonstration of her deep connection to him. And that, more than anything, made him realize the depth of the bond they had formed. It was a love not just rooted in gratitude, but in a fierce desire to shield one another from the harshness of the world. As Lena looked into his eyes, she knew that her promise would not be broken. She had no intention of letting anything or anyone tear them apart. She would remain by his side, guarding him with everything she had. And as the days passed, as they slowly built a life together in their quiet refuge, they both came to understand that in this world of uncertainty, there was no greater strength than the protective love they shared. As the days passed and the new life Lena had carefully started building for herself and Ethan began to take shape, there was an undeniable shift in both of them. For Ethan, the journey had been one of reckoning. The man he had been, selfish, cold, and consumed by his wealth, seemed like a distant memory now. Each moment he spent with Lena, each new day in the quiet comfort of their humble home, chipped away at the hardened shell he had carefully constructed around his heart. The change wasn't immediate, nor was it easy for him to acknowledge. Ethan had spent so many years wrapped in a bubble of privilege and entitlement that he couldn't immediately see how far removed he had become from the world he was born into. His life had been a series of indulgences, private jets, lavish dinners, and wealth that could buy him anything he wanted. Yet deep down, he had always felt empty. He had longed for connection, for someone who saw him as a person and not a source of wealth. But it wasn't until he had lost everything, until he had been reduced to nothing, that he truly understood what was missing. There were nights, when Lena was asleep, that Ethan lay awake in the quiet darkness, reflecting on the mistakes of his past. He thought of the people he had hurt, the friends he had betrayed, and the family members who had only used him for his money. His heart ached for the things he had done, but more so for the things he had never done, the kindnesses he had never shown, the love he had never given. In his pursuit of success and power, he had lost sight of the most important things in life. But it wasn't just the past that weighed heavily on his heart. Ethan's feelings of guilt were magnified by the way Lena had come into his life. He knew the only reason she had taken him in, the only reason she had cared for him when no one else would, was because of her selflessness. It was a kindness he had never experienced before, pure and unconditional. Lena wasn't after anything from him. She wasn't looking for his money, his power, or even his gratitude. She simply wanted to help him. And that had been his wake-up call. In that moment, as he lay awake, Ethan realized that it was time for him to redeem himself. The opportunity for redemption was no longer a far-off fantasy. It was here, in front of him, in the form of Lena's unwavering love and care. He had already been given a second chance, something many people never received in their lifetime. And it was because of her that he understood the true value of life, not in terms of money, but in terms of human connection. But redemption wasn't easy. Ethan knew that he couldn't just undo the mistakes of his past with a simple apology or a change of heart. It was going to take more than that. It was going to take action, sacrifice, and a willingness to put others before himself for the first time in his life. His wealth and his former life no longer had the power to define him. But there was something more powerful that had taken root within him: the desire to make things right. To do good, to right the wrongs he had committed, and to prove to Lena, to himself, that he was capable of being the man she believed he could be. One afternoon, as he sat across from Lena at their small kitchen table, something shifted in him. Lena was so lost in her thoughts, so deeply absorbed in her own work, that she didn't notice the change in his demeanor. Ethan had been struggling with how to approach this moment, how to express the overwhelming sense of guilt and shame he had carried for so long. But now, as he looked at her, he realized that he had been given something far more precious than money. He had been given a chance to rebuild, to grow, to be someone worthy of the love she had shown him. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Lena," Ethan began, his voice quieter than usual. "I've hurt people, taken everything for granted, and I've lived a life of selfishness for far too long. But what you've shown me, what you've given me, is something I'll never be able to repay. I can't change what's been done, but I can try to do better." Lena's eyes flickered up to meet his, but there was no judgment in her gaze. There was no anger or bitterness, only understanding and a quiet compassion that reached into the depths of Ethan's soul. He had expected her to say something, to give him some sort of comforting words or assurance, but instead, she simply nodded, as if she had known this moment was coming all along. "You don't have to repay me, Ethan," she said softly. "You're already doing it. Every day, every choice you make to be better. That's all anyone could ask for." Those words struck Ethan like a thunderbolt. He had expected to hear some form of absolution, a confirmation that he was forgiven. But what Lena had said was so much more than that. She wasn't offering him forgiveness out of pity. She was acknowledging his efforts to change, to grow. She was giving him the space to evolve, to redeem himself. Not because he had to, but because she believed in him. From that moment on, Ethan's path toward redemption became clearer. It was no longer about earning forgiveness from others. It was about becoming the kind of person who could look back at his past with a sense of peace, knowing that he had done everything in his power to make amends. He began to focus on giving back, helping those in need, supporting causes that mattered, and using his newfound wealth not for indulgence, but for positive change. In the quiet moments with Lena, when they sat side by side, Ethan realized that redemption wasn't just a journey, it was a process. Every day he had the opportunity to prove to himself, and to her, that he was no longer the man he had been. He was someone new, someone willing to fight for the better version of himself, and he knew that this new life with Lena was the greatest gift he could ever receive. And so, as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Ethan's transformation became evident not just to himself, but to everyone around him. The man who had once been consumed by his wealth and arrogance was now a man dedicated to kindness, to redemption, and to a love that had saved him from himself. And for the first time in his life, he understood that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it, growing beyond it, and using the lessons to build a better future. As the days continued to unfold, both Ethan and Lena found themselves at the crossroads of fate, a place where the unexpected loomed just around the corner. Despite the transformation Ethan had undergone, and the love that grew between them, there was something lingering in the air, something unsaid yet undeniably present. The luxury of his new life, his attempts at redemption, and the fragile peace they had built were all teetering on the edge of an impending storm. Something wasn't right, but neither of them could put their finger on it. It all began on a cold, rainy night. The atmosphere was thick with the promise of change. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone in silence. A message had come through, one that he hadn't expected, and certainly not one he was prepared for. It was a letter from the lawyers handling the remaining estate of his family, a final reminder of the wealth and power that had once consumed him. But this letter was different. This letter held the key to his past, one that had remained buried under years of silence. The contents of the letter were stark. There were threats from people he had wronged, hidden debts he had forgotten about, and a request for him to return to the life he had left behind. The language was cryptic, but it was clear that there were people who knew far too much about him, people who were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. For a split second, Ethan's heart sank, the air around him growing heavier with every word he read. He looked at the envelope again, his hand shaking slightly, as if the letter itself could reveal the truth of his very existence. Would his past catch up to him in a way that could destroy everything he had worked for? With Lena? Lena, sensing his distress, entered the room quietly, her gaze falling to the letter in Ethan's hand. She didn't need to ask. She already knew. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent understanding passing between them. Ethan's entire future was at stake. The skeletons of his past were no longer content to stay hidden in the shadows. They were now demanding their due. But then, something shifted inside him. It wasn't fear that coursed through him, nor regret for the choices he had made. It was something else, something raw, something deep. Ethan realized in that moment that no matter what these people wanted, no matter how they tried to manipulate him, he had already chosen his path. He had already committed to his new life, to making things right, and no letter, no threat could take that from him. The weight of his redemption, the love he had built with Lena, and the integrity he had fought so hard to regain all suddenly became the armor he needed. The past, no matter how threatening, would not break him now. With a steady breath, Ethan placed the letter down on the table, and his eyes met Lena's. "It's not going to change anything," he said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "I won't let it. I'm not that man anymore." Lena's eyes softened, and for a moment she said nothing. She simply walked over, wrapped her arms around him, and held him close. The moment was brief, but it was enough. In that small act of comfort, in the silence that followed, Ethan understood that it wasn't the external world that would define him anymore. It was his internal resolve, his unwavering will to change, and his commitment to the future he was building with Lena. The people who wanted him back in his old life could try as hard as they wanted. They could threaten, they could coerce, but in the end, they would never win. What happened next would change everything. That night, as the rain continued to pour, Ethan made a decision that would reverberate through the core of his being. He was going to confront his past. He wasn't going to run from it. He wasn't going to cower in fear. Instead, he was going to face it head-on, not as the man he once was, but as the man he had become. This was his moment of clarity. This was his test. The next day, Ethan made a phone call. He reached out to the people in his past, those who still held power over him, those who sought to use his mistakes against him. The conversation was tense, but there was something different in his tone now. There was no longer the air of someone who was trying to buy his way out, trying to maintain control through wealth or manipulation. Instead, there was honesty in his voice, a courage he had never known. "I'm not the same person I was," he told them, "and I'm not afraid of you anymore." There was silence on the other end of the line, a pause that seemed to stretch into eternity. And then a voice spoke, a voice filled with disbelief. "You're serious, aren't you?" Ethan smiled. Softly, knowing in his heart that this moment, this conversation, was the final step toward breaking free from the chains of his past. The past that had held him captive, the regrets that had tormented him, and the people who had tried to control him with fear, they were all gone now. His redemption was no longer a matter of chance or luck. It was his choice. And he had made it. As the call ended, Ethan felt something shift within him. A burden he didn't even realize he was carrying was finally lifted. For the first time in years, he could breathe deeply and freely, knowing that his future was no longer dictated by the shadows of his past. And as he turned to Lena, who had been watching him with unwavering support, he realized something truly profound. It was never about erasing the past. It was about standing strong in the face of it, embracing it, and using the lessons learned to create a better tomorrow. Ethan had conquered his past. He had turned his greatest challenge into his most powerful victory. And in that moment, he knew that no matter what life threw at him next, he would face it with strength, with integrity, and with the love of the one person who had always believed in him. No one, no threat, no obstacle could ever take that away from him. This was the moment of redemption. The moment when the past no longer held him back. The moment when Ethan realized that the true power of his life wasn't in what he had done, but in what he was capable of becoming. And as the sun set on that quiet evening, with the world still unaware of the quiet battle he had just won, Ethan and Lena stood side by side, knowing that their future was just beginning. The days that followed. The storm of revelations brought with them a profound sense of clarity. Ethan had finally come to terms with everything, the mistakes, the missteps, and the loss that had shaped him into the man he had once been. The shadows of his past, once so overpowering and suffocating, now seemed like distant echoes, fading, further away with every passing day. His redemption, though hard-earned, was no longer just a distant dream. It was a reality that lived within him, a truth that he carried with grace. But the real turning point wasn't just in what Ethan had overcome. It was in what he had found along the way. The love, the unwavering support, and the belief that Lena had in him, even when he couldn't see it himself, were the pillars that helped him rebuild. Together, they had built something new, something real. The mansion, the luxury, and the wealth, though important in some ways, no longer held the same weight they once had. What mattered most was the life they were creating, a life grounded in honesty, trust, and the shared understanding that their future was theirs to shape. Ethan stood at the balcony of their home, watching the sun set over the horizon. The sky, once so dark with uncertainty, was now painted with hues of pink and gold, reflecting the promise of a brighter tomorrow. He could feel the weight of the past lift from his shoulders, replaced by a sense of peace he had never known before. It was as if the universe had finally recognized his efforts, acknowledging the man he had become, and granting him the opportunity to move forward with a clean slate. Lena joined him outside, her presence a constant reminder of everything he had gained. She had been his anchor when the waves of doubt had threatened to swallow him whole. Together, they had navigated the treacherous waters of his past, and now, standing side by side, they were ready for whatever came next. Their hands brushed as they stood in silence, both lost in their own thoughts yet completely connected in their shared journey. "You know," Ethan began, his voice soft but filled with conviction, "I never thought I'd be here. Never thought I'd be standing here, looking out at this beautiful life with you." Lena smiled, her eyes warm and filled with understanding. "But you are, Ethan. You are exactly where you're meant to be." The words were simple, but they carried so much weight. Ethan had spent so long fighting against himself, against his past, against the mistakes that seemed to haunt him. But now, for the first time, he truly believed that everything had led him to this point. The life he had with Lena, the redemption he had fought for, and the peace that had settled in his heart. As they stood there watching the stars begin to twinkle in the night sky, Ethan realized that this was what true freedom felt like. It wasn't about escaping from the past. It was about embracing it, learning from it, and then choosing to move forward. The past would always be a part of him, but it would never define him again. "I've learned that redemption doesn't come from what we've lost," Ethan continued, his voice full of emotion. "It comes from what we choose to build from, the ashes. And together, we've built something beautiful." Lena turned to him, her eyes sparkling with tears, not of sadness, but of joy. "You did it, Ethan. You fought for your redemption and you never gave up on yourself or us." Ethan took a A deep breath, his heart swelling with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you. And in that moment, he understood something profound. True redemption wasn't just about changing the course of one's life. It was about recognizing that the people who love us, the people who believe in us, are the ones who help guide us to our better selves. Lena had been that light for him, and he would never take her for granted again. The two of them stood there, side by side, as the night settled in. The challenges they had faced were behind them, but the journey ahead was still full of unknowns. Yet they were no longer afraid. They had the strength, the love, and the resilience to face whatever came their way. The world outside, with all its chaos and uncertainty, no longer seemed so intimidating. They had each other, and together they were ready for whatever the future held. The mansion, the wealth, the power, all of that was secondary. What mattered now was their bond, the trust they had rebuilt, and the future they had decided to build together. As Ethan and Lena shared one final, long look at the horizon, they knew that no matter what came next, they were stronger than ever before. Their redemption wasn't just a personal journey, it was a shared one. A journey that was built on the foundation of love, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief that together they could overcome anything. And as they embraced the night hand in hand, their hearts full of hope and promise, they knew this was just the beginning. The past had been a teacher, the present was their gift, and the future was an adventure waiting to be written, one that they would write together forever.